I am Ethan, 28 years old. 2 years ago, my own brother stood up in the middle of a crowded church and tried to completely destroy my life. While I was standing at the altar, looking into the eyes of the woman I loved more than anything in this world, my own flesh and blood screamed that I was pathetic. My brother Richard pointed his finger at me and yelled, "You're marrying a waitress, Ethan. How pathetic can you be?" They laughed at my public school teacher's salary. They humiliated us in front of 200 guests, trying to turn what should have been the most sacred, beautiful day of my life into a public spectacle of cruelty and shame. But there was one massive thing they did not know. The woman they were mocking, the woman they thought was just some poor girl wiping down coffee shop tables, held a secret that would shatter their entire arrogant world into a million pieces. And now, the brother who tried to ruin my wedding is begging for a job scrubbing those exact same plates. Before I tell you exactly how they dug their own graves and sealed themselves inside, hit that like button if you believe in absolute karma. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the exact second my nightmare started. The air inside the church was thick and suffocating. It smelled heavily of white lilies and old polished wood, but mostly, it smelled of my family's suffocating judgment. The morning sun was shining through the massive stained glass windows, casting long, colorful, beautiful shadows across the cold stone floor, but there was absolutely nothing warm about the atmosphere in that room. I stood at the altar in my rented tuxedo. My collar felt incredibly tight. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought the microphone clipped to my lapel was going to pick up the sound. Beside me was Chloe. She looked absolutely stunning. She wore a simple, elegant white dress that we bought off the rack. It didn't cost a year's salary. It didn't have a designer label that my mother could brag about at her country club meetings. But to me, Chloe looked like royalty. Her hands were incredibly warm inside of mine, her grip steady and reassuring. Reverend Miller stood in front of us. He was a kind, soft-spoken older man who had known me since I was a little kid running around the neighborhood. He smiled warmly at us, adjusting his reading glasses. He cleared his throat, and his voice echoed perfectly into the high-vaulted ceiling of the sanctuary. If anyone knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. It is supposed to be a total formality. It is a dramatic pause meant for old romance movies, not real life. You hear those words at every wedding and you wait for the brief 2 seconds of silence to pass so the ceremony can move forward. But the silence that followed was violently, aggressively shattered by the loud scrape of heavy wood against stone. "This is an absolute joke." The voice tore through the quiet church like a gunshot. I didn't even need to turn my head to know exactly who it was. My jaw instantly locked. My knuckles turned stark white as I gripped Chloe's hands tighter. It was Richard, my older brother, the undeniable golden child of the Hayes family. I slowly turned my head, feeling a cold dread wash over my entire body. Richard was standing up in the third row right on the aisle. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. He looked like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. His wife, Victoria, sat beside him. She was clutching her designer purse, her posture perfectly rigid, and she had this incredibly smug, satisfied smirk plastered right across her face. My mother, Eleanor, sat next to them. She stared straight ahead at the altar, her face completely expressionless, not lifting a single finger to stop him. My father, Arthur, simply looked down at his expensive leather shoes. He was the eternal coward, the man who always kept the peace by letting the loudest, most aggressive voice in the room win every single time. "This is ridiculous," Richard shouted again. He stepped completely out of the pew and walked right into the center aisle, closing the distance between us. Loud whispers instantly erupted from the bride's side of the church. My friends, my co-workers, Chloe's small group of friends, they were all turning around, their faces masks of pure shock. "Ethan, you are making a massive mistake," Richard yelled, pointing his finger directly at my chest. "You are better than this. You're marrying a waitress, for God's sake. How pathetic can you be?" Every single word was a highly calculated strike. Richard never did anything by accident. He didn't just want to stop the wedding. He wanted to establish complete dominance. He wanted every single person in that room to know that my choices, my life, my salary, and my love were completely inferior to his investment portfolios, his real estate holdings, and his massive bank accounts. Reverend Miller stepped forward, raising a trembling hand. "Richard, please. This is a house of God. I must ask you to sit down immediately or I will have the ushers escort you outside." "Oh, you don't need to escort me anywhere. I am leaving," Richard scoffed loudly, dramatically adjusting his silk tie. He took one more step toward the altar, locking his dark eyes onto mine. "When this all completely falls apart, Ethan," Richard said, his voice dripping with pure venom and arrogance. "When you finally wake up and realize you cannot pay a mortgage or fund a college account on a public school teacher's salary combined with her little spare change tips from wiping down dirty tables, do not come crying to me. Do not ask me for a loan. You have made your bed. It's a very cheap, very sad one. Now lie in it." He turned on his heel, his heavy leather shoes clicking sharply and aggressively against the stone floor. Victoria stood up immediately, gave a highly dramatic, pitying shake of her head toward Chloe, and followed her husband. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church slammed shut behind them with a massive, echoing boom. They left a stunned, suffocating, dead silence in their wake. I slowly turned my head back to look at Chloe. I was terrified. Any other bride in the world would have been in absolute hysterics. Her day was ruined. Her mascara should have been running down her face. She should have been running out the side door in tears. But Chloe was not crying. Her bright green eyes were completely clear. Her breathing was totally calm. And then I saw it. The right corner of her mouth twitched upwards into a small, almost invisible, chillingly calm smile. She leaned forward, closing the distance between us until her lips were right next to my ear. Her voice was barely a whisper, meant for absolutely no one else in the world but me. "Should we tell him who I really am?" I looked at the empty center aisle. I looked at my parents, who were now leaning over and whispering furiously to my Uncle Thomas, shaking their heads in disgust. I felt a cold, hard, unbreakable resolve completely take over my chest. The fear was gone. The embarrassment was completely gone. I shook my head slowly, looking back into Chloe's eyes. "Not yet," I whispered back. Reverend Miller looked at me. His face was entirely pale. His hands were shaking so badly that the Bible he was holding was visibly vibrating. "Ethan, Chloe, I am so sorry. Shall we continue?" I didn't hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I looked the Reverend dead in the eye, my voice much louder and much firmer than it had been all day. "Yes, we are getting married today. Let's continue." As we turned back to face the altar, I felt this incredibly strange, overwhelming sense of calm wash over my entire being. Richard always thought I was a massive failure. He always thought he held absolutely all the cards because he had the corner office, the massive salary, and the aggressive corporate lawyer on retainer. He thought he had just delivered the ultimate humiliation, the final crushing blow to put me in my place forever. But as Chloe squeezed my hand, I knew something he didn't. I knew that my arrogant, untouchable brother had just walked blindly, full speed, into the greatest, most destructive trap of his entire life. To understand how we got to this exact moment, to understand the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of the mistake my brother just made, you have to understand the 28 years of toxic history that built this bomb. Growing up inside the Hayes family meant living in a constant, never-ending state of aggressive comparison, and the measuring stick was always Richard. He was exactly 6 years older than me, much louder, and ruthlessly, unapologetically ambitious. While I was out in the backyard catching frogs in the creek or reading history books on the porch, Richard was in his bedroom charting out his future corporate takeover. My parents absolutely worshipped the ground he walked on. To them, having children wasn't about raising good human beings. It was about building a brand. And Richard was their ultimate, highest-yielding return on investment. I remember the Thanksgiving dinners. They were never about family or gratitude. They felt more like hostile quarterly earnings reports. My mother, Eleanor, would spend 3 entire days meticulously preparing a massive feast, bringing out the crystal gravy boats and the fine china, just so she could hold court in the formal dining room and aggressively brag about Richard's latest corporate promotion to our extended family. Richard just closed a massive commercial real estate deal in downtown Chicago. My mother would announce loudly, pouring expensive red wine into her crystal glass. She would look around the table to make sure everyone was paying attention. His 401k is already vastly outperforming his father's, and he's only 30. The partners at the firm are practically begging him to take over the division. I was 22 at the time, fresh out of a state college with a degree in education. I wanted to teach middle school history. I wanted to be in the public school system. I wanted to actually make a tangible difference in kids' lives before they got lost in the cracks of a broken system. When I proudly announced at that same Thanksgiving table that I had finally landed my first official teaching job, the silence in the room was completely deafening. My father cleared his throat, suddenly finding the act of buttering a dinner roll to be the most fascinating thing in the entire world. "Teaching," Richard had said, leaning back in his expensive mahogany chair and slowly swirling his scotch. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and utter disdain. "That's very noble, Ethan. Really, it is. Someone has to babysit the kids of the people who actually run the world. Just don't expect to build much of an inheritance or a legacy on a government salary. You're going to be driving a used Honda until you're 70. That was the established dynamic. That was the law of the house. I was the sweet, naive charity case. He was the undisputed king." When Richard married Victoria, a woman whose entire personality and worth were completely based on her father's massive trust fund, my parents practically threw a city-wide parade. They happily drained a massive chunk of their own retirement savings to help pay for an outrageously extravagant wedding at the most exclusive country club in the state. They claimed it was a necessary investment in Richard's networking. I genuinely did not care about the money. I truly, honestly didn't. I loved my quiet, simple life. I loved my small, one-bedroom apartment. I loved my towering stacks of history books. And I loved the genuine, meaningful connections I made with my students every single day. But what I absolutely hated, what ate away at my soul for years, was the constant, suffocating, relentless disrespect. I hated that my actual worth as a human being, as a son, and as a brother was tied entirely to my tax bracket. And then I met Chloe. It was a freezing, rainy Tuesday afternoon in November. I was grading a massive stack of midterm history papers at a very high-end downtown cafe. I only went there because the heating in my apartment was broken. I was nursing a single, plain black coffee that I had been actively making last for over 2 hours. The cafe was buzzing with wealthy corporate types in sharp, tailored suits, all loudly discussing pending lawsuits, corporate mergers, and messy divorce settlements. Chloe was a waitress there. I had noticed her the second I walked in. It was completely impossible not to. She moved with this incredible, effortless grace, navigating the crowded, chaotic floor with a massive tray full of heavy ceramic mugs and plates. She had dark hair tied back in a slightly messy bun, zero makeup, and a bright smile that seemed to genuinely reach her eyes. That kind of genuine warmth was an extreme rarity in a neighborhood filled with stressed-out, aggressive executives. That afternoon, a guy in a tailored navy suit bumped incredibly hard into her shoulder while shouting profanities into his cell phone. The heavy tray instantly tipped. A massive, full, scalding hot cappuccino spilled directly onto my canvas laptop bag and all over my khaki pants. The businessman didn't even pause his stride. He didn't apologize. He just kept walking and yelling into his phone. Chloe gasped loudly, immediately dropping to her knees on the hard floor with a massive handful of napkins. "Oh my God, sir. I am so incredibly sorry. I will absolutely pay for the dry cleaning, I swear. Let me help you." She looked completely mortified. Most people in this specific zip code would have immediately started screaming at her. They would have demanded to see her manager, demanded she be fired on the spot, or threatened a ridiculous lawsuit over a ruined leather bag. Instead, I quickly grabbed my own stack of napkins and knelt down on the wet floor right next to her. "Hey, it's totally okay," I said gently, helping her wipe the spilled coffee off the linoleum floor. "It absolutely wasn't your fault. That guy was practically sprinting blindfolded. Besides, these pants were on the clearance rack at Walmart 3 years ago. They could honestly use a coffee stain to give them some character." She stopped wiping. She slowly looked up at me. Her deep green eyes locked directly onto mine, and for a split second, the entire noisy, chaotic cafe just completely faded away. She let out a small, breathless, relieved laugh. "You're really not going to yell at me and demand to see my manager?" she asked softly. "Only if your manager happens to have a functional time machine to stop that guy from running into you." I smiled. That was the exact beginning of everything. I stayed in that booth until her shift completely ended. We walked together in the freezing rain to a cheap, 24-hour neon-lit diner a few blocks away. We sat in a sticky vinyl booth, ordered terrible black coffee, and talked for 4 straight hours. She told me her name was Chloe. She said she worked in the service industry because she wanted to deeply understand people, to see exactly how the wealthy treated those they deemed below them. I told her all about my students, my deep passion for history, and my incredibly overbearing, status-obsessed, toxic family. We fell in love incredibly hard and incredibly fast. It was the most honest, unfiltered, purely genuine connection I had ever experienced in my entire life. We didn't care about fancy dinners or expensive, flashy gifts. We spent our weekends hiking in the state parks, cooking cheap pasta in my tiny kitchen, and building a solid life based on mutual respect and actual love. She knew I didn't make much money, and she always fiercely insisted on splitting every single bill directly down the middle. I loved her deeply for her fierce independence. After a solid year of dating, I finally decided it was time to introduce her to the family. It was a massive mistake. I should have seen the disaster coming from a mile away. My parents were hosting one of their rigid, formal Sunday dinners at their massive house in their gated community. Richard and Victoria were there, holding court in the living room as usual. I prepped Chloe as best as I possibly could in the car ride over. I told her they were difficult, that my mother treated HOA meetings like the United Nations, and that they cared entirely too much about outward appearances. Chloe just smiled, squeezed my hand, and said, "I deal with highly difficult, entitled people for a living, Ethan. I can handle one dinner." We arrived exactly on time. Chloe had worn a beautiful, simple, inexpensive floral dress. The moment we walked into the grand foyer, my mother's eyes instantly locked onto Chloe. I watched my mother scan her from head to toe, her eyes moving like a barcode scanner aggressively checking for a high-end designer price tag. She found none. "Chloe," my mother said, offering a stiff, perfectly manicured hand that was covered in diamond rings. "Ethan tells us you work in food service?" "Yes, Mrs. Hayes." Chloe smiled warmly, her voice perfectly polite. "I'm a server at the Sterling Cafe downtown." Victoria, sitting on the expensive velvet sofa with her legs crossed, let out a sound that was half laugh, half snort. "A server? How incredibly quaint. Is that a temporary stepping stone? Or is that the actual career plan?" "I genuinely enjoy the work," Chloe replied smoothly, her posture absolutely perfect. "It teaches you a tremendous amount about human nature and basic respect." The dinner was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. Richard spent the entire meal aggressively steering the conversation toward high finance, interest rates, and stock portfolios. He repeatedly asked me highly pointed, humiliating questions about my small salary and exactly how I planned to provide for a family or build a college fund on a public teacher's pension. Then came the absolute killing blow. Uncle Thomas, my father's brother, who always loved playing the role of the wise, concerned family mediator, leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the mahogany dining table. "Ethan, my boy," Uncle Thomas said, his voice dripping with thick, fake, patronizing concern. "We just worry about you. This world is brutal. Love is grand, But love doesn't pay for premium health insurance. Love doesn't secure a good mortgage rate in a safe neighborhood. You're bringing this young lady into a life of constant financial struggle. Are you absolutely sure that's fair to her? I gripped my silver fork under the table until my hand physically ached. I looked at my parents. They were actively nodding in agreement. They were actually sitting there, agreeing with Thomas that my perfectly honest, hardworking life was a burden and a failure. Before I could completely explode and flip the table, Chloe reached under the table and placed her hand firmly on my shaking knee. She looked directly at Richard, then at Thomas, her expression completely unbothered and terrifyingly calm. Ethan's life is richer than anyone I have ever met, Chloe said, her voice incredibly steady and crystal clear. He builds people up. He doesn't need to aggressively tear others down just to feel important. I think that is the most valuable asset a person can possibly have. Complete, stunned silence fell over the massive dining room. Victoria aggressively sawed into a piece of steak, her face red. Richard's dark eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Well, my mother finally said, her tone absolute ice. Just do not expect us to fund a wedding if you decide to take this little arrangement any further. We have extremely strict boundaries regarding our financial support for poor decisions. I immediately stood up, throwing my cloth napkin onto the table. Don't worry, Mom. I wouldn't take a single dime from you if my actual life depended on it. We're leaving. Now. As we drove back to my small apartment in the dark, I was shaking with pure, unadulterated anger. I apologized to Chloe repeatedly, practically begging for her forgiveness for exposing her to that toxicity. But she didn't look upset. She just looked out the passenger window into the passing streetlights, a calm, deeply calculating look in her bright green eyes. They measure absolutely everything by what they can see on a piece of paper, she said quietly into the dark car. Someday, Ethan, they are going to learn the hard way that paper burns very, very easily. 6 months later, I proposed to Chloe in the middle of a massive thunderstorm in my tiny living room. She said yes before I even finished asking the question. We decided right then and there to plan the wedding ourselves, entirely on our own terms. We didn't want a single cent of my family's money, and we certainly didn't want their toxic influence dictating our joy. But I drastically, foolishly underestimated the terrifying lengths my family would go to in order to assert their absolute dominance. I thought setting a firm boundary would keep them at bay. I was so incredibly, dangerously wrong. Planning the wedding on a public school teacher's salary and a waitress's income was an absolute masterclass in stretching a dollar until it screamed. I willingly took on extra, exhausting tutoring shifts after school, grading papers until my eyes burned. Chloe worked grueling double shifts at the cafe, coming home late with aching feet but a massive smile on her face. We sat at my small kitchen table with highlighters and spreadsheets, mapping out every single penny. We found a beautiful, modest, historic church that didn't charge an outrageous fee. And for the reception, we managed to book a very nice, mid-tier Italian restaurant that agreed to close down to the public for a few hours for a highly reasonable flat rate. It absolutely wasn't the Ritz-Carlton. It wasn't the country club where Richard got married. But it was going to be ours, paid for with our own sweat and hard work. I made the massive, stupid mistake of trying to involve my family just a tiny little bit. I was holding on to this desperate, foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, they would put aside their overwhelming snobbery for one single day to celebrate my happiness. I asked my younger cousin, David, to help me coordinate the groomsmen. David was a decent kid, or at least I thought he was. He was fresh out of college, desperately looking for a job in finance, and always seemed eager to please the older generation. Exactly 2 weeks before the wedding, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Uncle Thomas's name. Ethan, Thomas started, his voice thick with that signature, heavily patronizing concern that always made my blood pressure spike. I had a very interesting chat with young David yesterday. He mentioned the specific venue you booked for the reception. I tightened my grip on the phone, my jaw clenching. Yes, it's a very nice place. Good food. Good atmosphere. Ethan, I need you to be completely honest with me. Thomas lowered his voice to a theatrical, conspiratorial whisper. Did you take out a high-interest loan for this? Or worse, did you drain your retirement? I know a guy in real estate who handles debt consolidation and bankruptcy. Richard was looking at the commercial market in that specific area, and he told me the deposit alone for a place like that must have completely drained your pathetic savings. You are starting a marriage in a massive financial hole, all to impress a waitress. My blood instantly boiled. The betrayal stung like a physical slap. David had eagerly fed them all the private details of my wedding, and Thomas had immediately sprinted to Richard to dissect and mock my personal finances. I did not take out a loan, Thomas, I said coldly, my voice shaking with restrained fury. We saved for it, with our own money, and her name is Chloe, not a waitress. Right, of course, Thomas chuckled softly over the phone, a horrible, grating sound that made my skin crawl. Just don't let your stubborn pride absolutely ruin your credit score, son. We'll see you at the rehearsal. He hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. I realized right then that Thomas was never a mediator. He was Richard's personal spy. He was actively gathering ammunition so Richard could continue to feel vastly superior. The rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding was the exact catalyst that finally ignited the powder keg. Traditionally, the groom's parents pay for the rehearsal dinner. True to her icy word, my mother flatly refused to contribute a single dollar. So my best friend Marcus, a guy I had known since high school who now ran a highly successful contracting and construction business, stepped up. He generously offered to host a backyard barbecue at his place. It was relaxed, warm, and exactly what Chloe and I actually wanted. There were string lights, cold beers in coolers, and the smell of hickory smoke in the air. But Richard absolutely could not stand an event where he was not in total control. He showed up with Victoria a full hour late. Richard pulled his brand new, gleaming silver Porsche directly onto Marcus's lawn, ignoring the driveway entirely. He stepped out wearing a casual designer suit that cost more than Marcus's work truck. They didn't bring a gift. They didn't bring a side dish. They brought an incredibly toxic attitude. They stood rigidly in the far corner of the yard, nursing imported beers they had brought themselves, actively and loudly refusing to eat the barbecue Marcus had spent all day grilling. About halfway through the evening, when everyone was finally relaxed and laughing, Richard intentionally clinked his glass bottle heavily against a metal deck railing to loudly get everyone's attention. The entire yard went dead quiet. Speech time, Richard announced loudly, walking slowly toward the picnic table where Chloe and I were sitting. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his expensive jacket and pulled out a crisp, thick, bright white envelope. Ethan, Chloe, Richard began, projecting his deep voice so every single person in the yard could hear him perfectly. We all know weddings are incredibly stressful, especially when you are desperately trying to punch way above your weight class. Victoria snickered loudly behind him, sipping her beer. Marcus took a step forward, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists, but I held up a hand to stop him. I wanted to see exactly how far my brother would go. I wanted everyone to witness this. I talked to my accountant this morning, Richard continued, waving the thick envelope in the air like a prize. And Victoria and I decided that we want to help you guys out. Consider it an early wedding gift, or maybe just a charitable tax write-off. Whatever helps you sleep at night. He tossed the envelope onto the wooden picnic table directly in front of us. It landed with a heavy, insulting smack. There's exactly $10,000 in cash in there, Richard said, a vicious, wildly triumphant smile spreading across his face. Use it to pay off the high-interest credit cards I know you maxed out. Or better yet, Chloe, use it to go to night school. Get a real degree, because serving coffee and wiping up spills for people like me isn't a career. It's a trap for people with no ambition. And I do not want my brother permanently chained to a sinking ship. The silence in the backyard was absolute and terrifying. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect, the blatant weaponization of money to humiliate us in front of our closest friends, was breathtaking. Marcus suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Richard violently by the lapels of his expensive jacket. "You arrogant piece of trash," Marcus snarled, pulling Richard off balance, his face inches from my brother's. "Get the hell out of my yard right now before I break your jaw." "Marcus, stop," I shouted, standing up quickly and grabbing my best friend's thick shoulder. I pulled him back with all my strength. Richard simply straightened his jacket, looking completely unbothered, laughing softly to himself. "Violent, low-class friends, cheap burnt food, and a beggar's budget?" Richard sneered, looking around the yard with utter disgust. "Have a great little wedding tomorrow, Ethan." He turned and walked away, Victoria trailing closely behind him like a shadow. My parents, who had sat at a patio table watching the entire horrible exchange, didn't say a single word to defend me. They didn't scold Richard. They simply gathered their coats in silence and followed Richard out to the driveway. I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the white envelope on the table. It felt highly radioactive. I felt a deep, suffocating, crushing shame. Not for myself, but for the absolute fact that I actually shared DNA with these monsters. Chloe quietly reached out and picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't look at the cash. She just held it calmly in her hands. "I am so sorry," I whispered, my voice completely cracking under the weight of the humiliation. "I am so damn sorry you have to deal with this family." Chloe looked up at me. There were absolutely zero tears in her eyes. Instead, there was a fierce, protective, terrifyingly cold fire burning in them. "Do not apologize for them, Ethan," she said, her voice steady and hard. "They just showed us exactly who they are. They showed us their entire hand. And tomorrow we are going to show them exactly who we are." Late that night, the night before the wedding, we were back in our small, quiet apartment. I was sitting on the edge of the mattress, my head buried in my hands, exhausted down to my very bones. I was terrified that Richard's cruelty had permanently broken something irreparable in our joy. Chloe walked into the dimly lit bedroom. She sat down right next to me and placed a small, sleek, heavy black card on the wooden nightstand. I stared at it. It wasn't a standard credit card. It was incredibly heavy, made of matte metal, with absolutely no bank logo on it. There was just a series of numbers and her name, Chloe Sterling, embossed in sharp silver lettering. I looked at the card, confused, then back at her. "What is this?" "Ethan," she said softly, taking both of my shaking hands in hers. "Do you trust me?" "With my life," I answered instantly. "Tomorrow is going to be chaotic," she said, her voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone. "Richard is going to try something at the church. I know he is. People like him cannot stand to see someone else happy without asserting their dominance and ruining it. But I promise you, no matter what happens in that church tomorrow, you keep your head high. You do not let him break you. You do not react to his anger." She reached out and tapped the heavy black metal card with her fingernail. It made a sharp clicking sound. "Because the second the ceremony is over, the rules completely change," she whispered, a fierce smile playing on her lips. "Tomorrow, Ethan, we aren't just getting married. We are going to war. And I promise you we have the much, much bigger guns." I didn't fully understand what she meant at that moment. I thought maybe she had a secret, hidden savings account, or perhaps she had called in a massive favor from a wealthy relative. I had absolutely no idea that the humble woman sitting next to me wasn't just a waitress. I had no idea that she held the absolute keys to an empire that could buy and sell Richard's entire pathetic existence before breakfast. The morning of the wedding dawned incredibly cold and ominously gray. The sky looked like a deeply bruised plum, threatening a massive rainstorm that never quite fell. I stood in the small, cramped rectory room behind the church altar, aggressively adjusting my rented bow tie in a cracked, cloudy mirror. Marcus was standing right beside me, acting as my best man, quietly brushing invisible lint off the shoulder of his rented suit. "You good, man?" Marcus asked, watching my pale face in the reflection of the mirror. "I'm fine," I lied through my teeth. My stomach was a tight, painful knot of anxiety. I wasn't nervous about marrying Chloe. That was the only thing in my life I was absolutely 100% sure of. I was terrified of my family. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Through the thin, cheap wooden door of the rectory, I could clearly hear the guests arriving and taking their seats. I could hear the distinct, piercing, complaining voice of my Aunt Clara echoing in the hallway. "Carnations, really?" Clara's voice drifted clearly through the wood. "Eleanor, I thought you explicitly told Ethan to hire a decent, reputable florist. This looks like a cheap funeral parlor. Arthur and I had absolutely no part in this." My mother's voice replied, sharp, defensive, and loud enough for me to hear on purpose. "This is entirely Ethan's little budget project. You get exactly what you pay for when you refuse help." I closed my eyes tight, taking a deep, shuddering breath to center myself. I forced myself to remember Chloe's words from the night before. "Keep your head high. Do not let them break you." Exactly 10 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, the rectory door suddenly opened. A woman stepped inside, firmly closing the door behind her. She was definitely not a guest I recognized. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal blazer, perfectly pressed black slacks, and she held a discreet earpiece in her left ear. She had a thick clipboard in her hand and carried the intense, highly focused, intimidating aura of a high-powered corporate lawyer or a Secret Service agent. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice crisp, efficient, and demanding attention. "Yes," I asked, exchanging a highly confused look with Marcus. "I'm Sarah. I work closely with Chloe," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was incredibly firm and entirely professional. "Oh," I said, blinking rapidly. "You work at the cafe downtown? I don't think I've ever seen you there." Sarah gave a brief, tight smile that absolutely did not reach her eyes. "Something like that. Chloe sent me ahead to ensure everything on the groom's side is secure and ready. Do you have the rings?" "I've got them right here," Marcus said, patting his jacket pocket, looking at Sarah with intense suspicion. Sarah nodded, aggressively tapping her pen against her clipboard. "Excellent. Listen to me carefully. The transport is waiting directly at the side exit for after the ceremony. Do not, under any circumstances, take the main doors out to the street where the guests are exiting. Is that clearly understood?" "Transport?" I frowned, my confusion deepening. "We rented a standard black town car. It should be parked out front on the main street." "Plans have been upgraded," Sarah stated flatly, leaving absolutely zero room for argument. "Trust Chloe. Follow my instructions. I will see you both at the reception." She turned sharply on her heel and marched out the door before I could ask a single follow-up question, leaving Marcus and me staring blankly at the closed door. "Dude," Marcus muttered, his eyes wide. "Who the hell was that?" She looked like she was about to call in an airstrike, not coordinate a wedding. "I have absolutely no idea," I breathed, the knot in my stomach tightening with a completely new kind of tension. It wasn't fear anymore. It was pure anticipation. Suddenly, the heavy, beautiful notes of the church organ started playing. It was time. I walked out of the rectory and took my place at the altar. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. I actively refused to look at the third pew where I knew my parents and Richard were sitting. When the heavy back doors opened and Chloe began to walk down the aisle, the entire chaotic world outside of her simply ceased to exist. She was breathtaking, but beneath the delicate white veil, I could clearly see the sharp, highly focused, dangerous intelligence in her bright green eyes. She wasn't a nervous, trembling bride. She looked like an absolute queen confidently walking to her coronation. And then, as we stood there at the altar, holding hands and exchanging our vows, Richard launched his calculated, vicious attack. Which brings us right back to that exact moment in the church. The moment he screamed that I was pathetic for marrying a waitress. The moment he humiliated us, stormed out, pulled Victoria with him, slammed the heavy wooden doors, and left a suffocated, horrified silence in the sanctuary. Shall we continue?" Reverend Miller asked, his hands trembling violently as he held the Bible. "Yes," I said firmly, my voice echoing in the silent church. "Let's continue." We finished the vows. The rings were exchanged. When Reverend Miller finally pronounced us husband and wife, the applause from Marcus and my few loyal friends was incredibly loud, aggressively attempting to drown out the awkward, judging silence radiating from my family's side of the aisle. My parents sat completely rigid in their pew, looking visibly embarrassed to even share my last name. David, my cousin who had betrayed my trust to Uncle Thomas, stared at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. As we walked back up the center aisle together as husband and wife, Chloe leaned her head onto my shoulder. Her voice was incredibly steady, laced with a highly dangerous, thrilling kind of calm. "Did Sarah come talk to you in the back?" she whispered, keeping a brilliant, perfect smile on her face for the photographer's flashing cameras. "Yes," I murmured back, keeping my own smile plastered on my face. "She said something very specific about transport waiting at the side exit." "Good," Chloe said, her grip on my hand tightening. "Follow my lead. The storm is over, Ethan. Now we bring the earthquake." As we reached the back of the church, instead of pushing through the main double doors to greet the confused, whispering guests on the front steps, we veered sharply to the left. We slipped through the narrow, dimly lit hallway that led directly to the small alleyway beside the church. I fully expected to see the slightly dented, cheap black Lincoln Town car we had booked for $100 idling by the dumpsters. Instead, idling completely silently in the narrow alleyway, gleaming impossibly bright under the gray, overcast sky, was a massive, pitch-black, brand-new Rolls-Royce Phantom. The chrome was polished to an absolute mirror finish. A driver in a full, immaculate black uniform and white gloves stood at strict attention by the open rear door. I stopped dead in my tracks. My jaw practically hit the pavement. "Chloe," I stammered, looking from the multimillion-dollar car to my beautiful wife. "Whose car is this? What did you do? We absolutely cannot afford this. If Richard sees this pulling up to the reception, he'll think I took out another massive, high-interest loan just to show off." Chloe stepped forward, pulling me gently with her. The driver immediately bowed his head slightly. "Good afternoon, Miss Sterling. Congratulations on your marriage," the driver said respectfully. "Miss Sterling." She turned to face me, lifting her white veil back completely over her head. The warm, modest, quiet waitress I had known and loved for 2 years was gone. Standing in her place, radiating absolute power, confidence, and immense, untouchable wealth, was a completely different woman. "It's my car, Ethan," she said softly, reaching out to gently touch my cheek. "It's always been my car, and Richard is about to find out, in front of the entire world, that the poor little waitress he just publicly humiliated owns the very ground he stands on." I thought the absolute worst of the day was over. I was so incredibly, beautifully wrong. The real destruction hadn't even begun. I stood completely frozen in the damp, narrow alleyway behind the church, staring blankly at the massive, gleaming black Rolls-Royce Phantom. My brain simply refused to process the reality of what was happening directly in front of me. For 2 entire years, I had known Chloe as a hardworking, highly modest waitress. I knew her as the woman who carefully counted her crumpled dollar bills from her tip jar to help pay for our groceries. I knew her as the woman who willingly split the cost of cheap Friday night takeout dinners, who aggressively hunted for discount coupons, and who worried right alongside me about the rising cost of our winter electric bill. Now, she was standing casually next to a bespoke luxury vehicle that cost substantially more than the entire working-class neighborhood I grew up in. A highly trained driver wearing a perfectly pressed black uniform and pristine white gloves was physically bowing his head to her in absolute reverence. "Get in, Ethan," Chloe said smoothly. Her voice was completely devoid of the suffocating anxiety that had plagued us all morning. She gracefully slid into the cavernous, luxurious back seat of the Phantom, looking like she had done this a million times before. I followed her blindly, my legs feeling incredibly heavy, like lead weights were attached to my ankles. The heavy reinforced doors closed with a solid, completely soundproof thud, instantly cutting off the chaotic noise of the city streets and the distant chatter of our confused wedding guests. The interior of the vehicle smelled of incredibly rich, custom-stitched leather and absolute, undeniable perfection. I sank deep into the plush seat, turning my head to look at the woman I had just married. She had completely removed her delicate white veil, and the soft, ambient luxury lighting of the car's interior illuminated a fierce, hardened, intensely determined expression on her beautiful face that I had absolutely never seen before. "Chloe, please tell me what is going on," I asked, my voice barely above a hoarse whisper. "You just called yourself Miss Sterling. What does that actually mean? And why are we driving downtown? The mid-tier Italian restaurant we booked for the wedding reception is in the completely opposite direction. We are going to be incredibly late to our own wedding, and Richard is going to use that as another excuse to publicly humiliate us." Chloe reached over to the polished mahogany center console and smoothly poured 2 glasses of sparkling water from a heavy crystal decanter. She handed me one, her hand perfectly steady, not a single tremor of nerves to be found. "We are absolutely not going to that mid-tier Italian restaurant, Ethan," Chloe said, taking a slow, calculated sip of her water. "That restaurant was a complete decoy venue. I booked it months ago entirely to give your brother Richard and your Uncle Thomas something specific to actively investigate and loudly mock. I knew exactly how they operated. I knew they would immediately try to aggressively dig into our personal finances. I knew they would run straight to their shady real estate contacts to illegally check the commercial lease agreements and investigate the exact deposit amounts we supposedly put down. I purposely fed them exactly the pathetic, low-budget narrative they desperately wanted to believe." "A decoy," I repeated, my mind spinning violently out of control. "But the wedding invitations, the exact addresses we sent out to all 200 of our guests, the deposits. Sarah, my executive assistant, intercepted the guest redirection this morning while the ceremony was taking place," Chloe explained calmly, her eyes fixed on the passing skyscrapers outside the tinted windows. "Every single person on the groom's side, every single person on my side, and all of our actual, genuine friends were handed discreet, updated location cards by Sarah's private security team as they exited the church doors. They are currently being redirected to the actual venue right now." "And where exactly is this actual venue?" I asked, gripping the heavy crystal glass so tightly I honestly thought the thick glass might shatter in my hand. "We are officially hosting the reception at the Sterling Grande," she replied flatly, casually naming the most exclusive, ridiculously expensive, internationally renowned 6-star hotel and private event space in the entire state. It was a massive, imposing fortress of extreme wealth. It was the specific place where international diplomats, tech billionaires, and Hollywood celebrities hosted their ultra-private galas. You could not even walk into the opulent marble lobby of the Sterling Grande without an exclusive platinum membership or a highly vetted corporate invitation. "The Sterling Grande?" I choked on my water, coughing violently. "Chloe, you have to be kidding me. That place requires a deposit equivalent to a massive down payment on a luxury mansion. We absolutely cannot afford that on a teacher's salary. Richard is going to have an absolute field day with this. He is going to literally stand up in the middle of the ballroom and loudly announce to everyone that I took out a highly predatory loan or committed massive financial fraud just to show off to him. He is going to call the police." Chloe smiled. It was a completely cold, highly calculated, beautifully dangerous smile. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey walk directly into a perfectly designed trap. "I want him to think exactly that," Chloe whispered, reaching out to gently touch my cheek. "Let him walk through those golden doors thinking he still holds absolutely all the power in the world. I want him to feel incredibly comfortable in his massive arrogance. Because the higher he confidently climbs on his pathetic pedestal of superiority, the much, much harder the concrete is going to hit his face when he inevitably falls." Meanwhile, all the way across town, that exact trap was already perfectly set and patiently waiting to violently snap shut. I later learned the exact, excruciating details of what happened when my family proudly arrived at the Sterling Grande, courtesy of my best man Marcus and the high-definition security footage Sarah later saved for me. Richard and Victoria pulled their gleaming silver Porsche aggressively up to the massive, imposing gold-leafed double doors of the luxury hotel. They were visibly furious and highly insulted. They genuinely thought the updated location card they received at the church was some kind of stupid, elaborate, desperate joke I was playing to somehow save face after the massive humiliation at the altar. Richard marched aggressively past the stunned valet attendants, completely ignoring the polite doorman, and strutted right up to the main concierge desk in the breathtaking, cavernous marble lobby. My parents, Eleanor and Arthur, along with Uncle Thomas, followed closely behind him like obedient little sheep. They were looking nervously up at the massive, cascading crystal chandeliers and the towering, imported exotic floral arrangements that likely cost more than an entire 4-year college fund. "There has been a massive, ridiculous miscommunication here," Richard barked loudly at the front desk, slamming his palm flat on the polished imported marble. "My brother, Ethan Hayes, supposedly relocated his cheap little budget wedding reception to this exact address. Obviously, someone in your management team has made a severe administrative error. You people do not host events for public school teachers who can barely afford a decent mortgage." Julian, the seasoned general manager of the Sterling Grande, was already waiting for him. Julian was a man who had personally dealt with obnoxious, demanding billionaires and entitled celebrities for decades. He knew exactly how to handle loud, arrogant bullies. "Mr. Richard Hayes, I presume?" Julian asked smoothly, adjusting his immaculate, custom-tailored suit jacket, his expression completely unreadable. "Yes, obviously," Richard snapped, leaning aggressively over the high counter. "And I demand to know exactly what kind of fraudulent financial paperwork my pathetic brother submitted to you people to temporarily secure a ballroom here. I am a highly licensed financial advisor. I manage a highly successful investment firm downtown. I can personally guarantee you right now that Ethan absolutely does not have the liquid assets, the collateral, or the credit score to even afford the appetizers in your kitchen, let alone a fully catered private reception. He is highly likely committing massive fraud, and I will absolutely not let my pristine family name be dragged into a messy corporate lawsuit." Julian simply offered a polite, completely impenetrable professional smile. "Mr. Hayes, I can assure you that all financial obligations regarding this specific event have been completely settled in full. There is absolutely no fraud taking place on these premises. The grand ballroom has been exclusively reserved for the Hayes Sterling wedding reception. If you and your family would please follow the head hostess, we have a premium table waiting for you near the front of the stage." Richard looked completely stunned for a brief second, and then deeply, intensely suspicious. He turned to Victoria, his face twisting into an ugly, mocking sneer. "Do you see this absolute madness? He must have taken out a massive, predatory loan from a shadow lender. He probably illegally leveraged his pathetic teacher's pension. He is going to be absolutely, entirely bankrupted by tomorrow morning. This is pathetic. He is financially destroying his entire future just to desperately prove a point to me. It's just incredibly sad and desperate," Victoria chimed in, aggressively adjusting her expensive designer purse and looking around the opulent, breathtaking lobby with a highly critical, jealous eye. "All this fake luxury for a little waitress. It's literally like putting a cheap, tacky bumper sticker on a brand new Ferrari." My mother, Eleanor, sighed heavily, shaking her head in profound disappointment. "I absolutely refuse to pay for his bankruptcy lawyer when the massive bill finally comes due. I absolutely refuse. We tried to warn him. He made this terrible bed. He can lie in it." They all aggressively marched into the grand ballroom like they were reluctantly walking into a peasant's dirty mud hut. They took their assigned seats at a massive, beautifully decorated table right near the center dance floor. The room was breathtakingly beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view overlooking the entire city skyline. The massive tables were draped in heavy, imported silk, covered in massive, towering arrangements of rare white orchids, and completely surrounded by heavy gold-plated cutlery. Marcus, my loyal best friend, was seated at a table nearby with the rest of my groomsmen. He later told me that Richard spent the entire first hour of the reception actively, loudly, and obnoxiously mocking every single detail of the room. Richard loudly complained to the waiters about the quality of the vintage champagne, arrogantly claiming his own personal wine cellar was vastly superior. He loudly hypothesized to Uncle Thomas about the exact, crippling interest rate on the loan I must have taken out. He was completely, utterly comfortable in his absolute, unshakable superiority. He had absolutely no idea that he was sitting right in the exact center of a meticulously designed kill zone, and the countdown had already reached 0. Back in the Rolls-Royce Phantom, the massive car smoothly pulled to a stop at the highly secured, private VIP underground entrance of the hotel. The driver immediately rushed out and opened the heavy door. Chloe stepped out into the private garage, looking absolutely radiant, fiercely powerful, and completely unstoppable. She reached her delicate hand back into the dark interior of the car for me. "Are you absolutely ready to meet my family, Ethan?" she asked softly, her green eyes shining with an intense, thrilling light. I took a massive, deep breath, grabbing her warm hand tightly. I stepped out of the car. I still didn't know exactly how wealthy she was, but looking at the private security detail waiting for us, I knew my life was never, ever going to be the same again. "I'm ready," I said, my voice finally steady. We walked swiftly to the private, gold-plated elevator. The heavy doors slid closed silently, and we began the rapid, stomach-dropping ascent to the grand ballroom level. I foolishly thought the absolute worst was over. I thought the drama was contained. I was completely wrong. The real, catastrophic storm was just about to break, and it was going to wash my toxic family entirely off the map. The private elevator doors opened with a soft, pleasant melodic chime. We stepped out into a heavily secluded hallway located directly behind the massive main stage of the grand ballroom. Through the thick, heavy velvet curtains, I could clearly hear the lively, upbeat sounds of a professional 20-piece jazz band and the low, echoing murmur of 200 guests mingling. Sarah, the terrifyingly efficient assistant, was standing right there waiting for us, holding her thick clipboard, her discreet earpiece glowing faintly in the dim hallway light. "The primary targets are completely relaxed and highly vocal," Sarah reported directly to Chloe. Her voice was strictly professional, sounding exactly like a military commander delivering a battlefield update before a massive strike. "Richard Hayes has publicly insulted the catering staff 3 separate times and loudly discussed your husband's fabricated financial ruin to anyone who would listen within a 50-foot radius. The trap is perfectly primed and ready for execution." "Excellent," Chloe nodded sharply. She turned to face me, her green eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent literal shivers down my spine. "Ethan, please remember exactly what I told you last night. When we walk out there, do not react with anger. Do not yell. Do not stoop to his pathetic level. Absolute silence and complete composure are the absolute most terrifying weapons you can possibly use against a raging narcissist." I nodded slowly, my heart hammering a frantic, adrenaline-fueled rhythm against my ribs. Suddenly, the live jazz music came to an abrupt, complete stop. A heavy, highly expectant silence immediately fell over the massive ballroom. Julian, the general manager, stepped up to the polished microphone stand in the center of the brightly lit stage. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp sound echoing clearly across the massive room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's rich, commanding, highly professional voice filled the space. "May I please have your absolute attention? It is my immense, profound honor to officially introduce the bride and groom. Please warmly welcome Mr. Ethan Hayes and his beautiful bride, Miss Chloe Sterling." The heavy, dark velvet curtains parted automatically. The incredibly bright, warm spotlights instantly hit us. We walked slowly out onto the elevated stage, our hands tightly interlocked. The applause from my true friends and Chloe's guests was completely deafening, but as my eyes rapidly adjusted to the bright lights, I immediately, instinctively sought out Richard's table. Richard was sitting there, leaning back in his chair with a massive, arrogant, highly condescending smirk plastered across his face. He actually raised his expensive crystal glass of champagne toward me in a highly mocking, sarcastic toast. He was impatiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. He was waiting for the music to start so he could loudly corner me, cause a massive scene, and demand to see the financial paperwork for the venue to humiliate me further. But the music did not start. Instead, Julian remained standing firmly at the microphone. He cleared his throat loudly. Before we begin the traditional first dance, Julian announced, his voice suddenly shifting from the tone of a welcoming host to one of deep, absolute reverence. We have a very special guest who wishes to say a few brief words. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand and welcome the founder and chairman of the Sterling Group, Mr. William Sterling. A collective, massive gasp of absolute shock rippled through the entire room. I felt my stomach completely drop into my shoes. The Sterling Group. Even I knew that name. They owned international luxury hotel chains, massive commercial real estate blocks across the globe, and multi-billion-dollar private investment funds. They were legitimate billionaires. They were absolute corporate royalty in America. From the side of the stage, an older gentleman walked out slowly into the spotlight. He was in his late 70s, walking carefully with a highly polished silver-tipped cane, but his posture was completely, perfectly straight, and his sheer presence commanded absolute, terrifying authority. He wore a bespoke tuxedo, and his sharp, piercing, highly intelligent blue eyes scanned the room like a hungry hawk looking for prey. William Sterling walked directly over to Chloe. He completely ignored the microphone and the massive crowd for a moment. He reached out and pulled her into a massive, warm, incredibly loving hug. "My beautiful granddaughter," William said loudly, his voice incredibly strong and clear, carrying across the silent stage without even needing the microphone. "You look absolutely perfect today." He turned slowly and looked directly at me. He extended a firm, weathered, powerful hand. I shook it, my mind entirely blank, my jaw practically on the floor. "Ethan," the billionaire said, giving me a warm, highly genuine smile. "I have heard nothing but absolutely wonderful things about your deep character and your integrity. Welcome to our family, son." Then William Sterling turned his body slowly toward the crowd. He stepped up to the microphone. The massive room was so incredibly quiet you could literally hear a pin drop onto the marble floor. When Chloe told me a few years ago that she was working entirely undercover in one of our downtown cafes to learn the hospitality business from the ground up, I was incredibly proud of her work ethic. William began, his deep voice echoing with absolute authority. When she told me she had fallen deeply in love with a humble public school teacher who valued history, education, and genuine human connection over corporate greed and profit margins, I was completely overjoyed. He paused dramatically, leaning heavily on his silver cane. His piercing blue eyes slowly scanned the crowd, moving from table to table, until they locked directly onto Richard's location. I watched Richard's face closely. The arrogant, condescending smirk was completely, entirely gone. The color was rapidly draining from his cheeks, leaving him looking exactly like a pale, sickly ghost. Victoria had completely frozen in her seat, her glass of champagne hovering halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. "However," William continued, his voice suddenly dropping an entire octave, turning completely cold and incredibly dangerous, "I was highly disturbed and deeply disgusted to hear about a certain incident that occurred at the sacred church ceremony this morning. I was reliably informed by my security team that a member of the groom's own family stood up and publicly humiliated my granddaughter. I believe the exact, pathetic phrase used was, 'You are marrying a waitress? How pathetic can you be?'" A massive wave of shocked, disgusted murmurs swept violently through the room. My mother, Eleanor, physically shrank down into her expensive velvet chair, desperately trying to hide behind a massive floral arrangement. Uncle Thomas looked like he was literally going to vomit all over the table. William Sterling raised his silver cane and pointed it directly at Richard's chest. "You, young man," William barked, his voice cracking like a violent whip across the ballroom. Stand up. Richard hesitated. He looked frantically around the room, his chest heaving, realizing he was completely and utterly trapped. He slowly pushed his heavy chair back and stood up, his knees visibly shaking so hard he could barely remain upright. The aggressive shark had instantly turned into a cornered, terrified minnow facing a leviathan. Mr. Sterling, sir," Richard stammered, his voice incredibly pathetic, weak, and shaking. "There has been a massive misunderstanding. A terrible, out-of-context joke. I meant absolutely no disrespect whatsoever to your incredible family or your massive empire." "Do not insult my intelligence, boy," William snapped, cutting him off instantly with a wave of his hand. "You run a small boutique investment firm downtown, do you not? A firm that heavily relies on premium commercial real estate leases in the financial district to maintain its wealthy image." "Yes, sir," Richard whispered, sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a shaking hand. "Those specific buildings belong to the Sterling Group," William stated flatly, delivering the absolute killing blow with effortless, terrifying precision. "You lease your massive corner office directly from my granddaughter's trust. The very ground you confidently walk on, the expensive walls you hide behind, are completely owned by the incredible woman you just publicly called a pathetic waitress. And as of 8 a.m. this Monday morning, my massive legal team will be thoroughly reviewing all of your corporate lease agreements, your business conduct, and your ethical standards. I highly suggest you start aggressively looking for a new office. Perhaps a cheap, damp basement out in the suburbs would suit your character better." Richard physically stumbled backward, completely losing his balance, knocking his heavy chair over. The wooden chair crashed onto the solid marble floor with a loud, echoing bang. He was completely, utterly destroyed. His entire toxic identity, built entirely on money and status, had just been effortlessly crushed into dust by a man who actually possessed real power. "Furthermore," William continued, turning his icy, unforgiving glare toward my absolutely terrified parents, "anyone who actively enables or silently supports such toxic, pathetic arrogance has absolutely no place at this joyful celebration. Julian, kindly escort this entire section of the table to the service elevator immediately. They are no longer welcome on Sterling property, today or ever again." Julian immediately signaled, and 6 massive, incredibly professional security guards instantly descended upon Richard's table. My mother started crying hysterically, completely abandoning her rigid, snobby posture. She reached her shaking hands out desperately toward the stage, looking at me. "Ethan, please, tell them we are family. Tell them this is a terrible mistake. You can't do this to us. We are your parents. You have to protect us." I stood perfectly still on the bright stage. I looked down at the woman who had happily, silently watched her golden child violently tear me down for 28 years. I vividly remembered the awful Thanksgiving dinners. I remembered the disastrous rehearsal dinner. I remembered the white envelope full of cash thrown maliciously at my feet. I leaned forward toward the microphone. My voice was perfectly calm, completely devoid of any emotion. "I don't know these people," I said clearly. "Please remove them from my wedding." As the security guards physically marched my screaming mother, my completely silent, cowardly father, a violently sobbing Victoria, and a completely broken, catatonic Richard out the back doors, Chloe reached over and tightly grabbed my hand. The absolute, pure relief that washed over me was entirely indescribable. The toxic, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders my entire life was finally gone. We had completely won. But the universe wasn't quite done with Richard yet. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. A full year passed after that incredibly chaotic wedding day. Our lives settled into an incredibly beautiful, profoundly peaceful rhythm. Despite officially marrying into a billionaire family, I absolutely refused to quit my job. I still drove my highly dependable used car to work every morning. I still packed my own simple lunches in brown paper bags, and I still taught middle school history every single day. I loved my students deeply, and I absolutely loved the profound sense of purpose my career gave me. Walking into a classroom and seeing those kids learn was worth more to me than any massive bank account. Chloe stepped completely into her massive role within the Sterling Group, actively managing complex corporate mergers and high-level, billion-dollar real estate acquisitions. She was a powerhouse in the boardroom, but at home, she was just Chloe. We lived in a stunning, highly secure penthouse overlooking the city, yes, but our daily lives were firmly built on the exact same foundation of mutual respect, brutal honesty, and genuine love that we had established in that cheap, sticky neon diner on our very first date. We had permanently cut off all contact with my toxic family. My mother repeatedly tried sending manipulative, guilt-tripping letters demanding family loyalty and complaining about how she felt like she was attending a funeral because she had lost a son. Uncle Thomas tried leaving unhinged, demanding voicemails asking for access to our newfound wealth to help the family out of a tight spot. I immediately blocked their numbers and marked the letters as returned to sender without even opening them. I was finally at absolute peace. But Richard's life, on the other hand, was rapidly spiraling into an absolute, inescapable nightmare of his own making. William Sterling was absolutely not a man who made empty, dramatic threats. True to his terrifying word, at exactly 8 a.m. on the Monday morning after the wedding, Sterling Group's massive, ruthless legal team aggressively descended upon Richard's boutique investment firm. They didn't just casually cancel his premium commercial leases. They aggressively and thoroughly audited his financial standing as a tenant, utilizing every legal loophole available to scrutinize his business practices. What the lawyers found completely blew the heavy doors off Richard's fake, perfectly curated empire. It quickly turned out that Richard's incredible, flashy wealth, his brand new silver Porsche, and his closets full of custom Italian suits were heavily built on a foundation of absolute sand. In a desperate, pathetic effort to constantly maintain his image as a financial genius and keep up with his wealthy, demanding father-in-law, Richard had been cutting massive, highly illegal corners for years. He was actively running a highly sophisticated, deeply illegal Ponzi scheme. He was actively mixing client funds, completely falsifying quarterly return reports, and illegally using new investor money to silently pay off the old ones. Meanwhile, he was aggressively skimming a massive, completely unearned salary off the top to lavishly fund his extravagant, showy lifestyle. The Sterling lawyers immediately flagged the massive financial irregularities and eagerly handed the incredibly thick, damning file directly over to Inspector Vance at the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The ensuing collapse was sudden, highly violent, and entirely humiliatingly public. I vividly remember sitting on the comfortable couch in our living room, eating takeout pizza with Chloe, watching the local evening news. Suddenly, the breaking news banner flashed a bright, urgent red across the bottom of the massive television screen. There was live, high-definition helicopter footage showing dozens of heavily armed federal agents actively raiding Richard's massive, glass-walled corner office building. They were physically hauling out dozens of heavy cardboard boxes full of hard drives, accounting ledgers, and highly classified financial documents. The news anchor's voice was completely objective, delivering the final, crushing blow to Richard's ego. Richard Hayes, a formerly prominent local financial advisor, has been formally indicted today on multiple severe federal charges of wire fraud, massive embezzlement, and grand larceny. Authorities currently state the elaborate scheme systematically defrauded vulnerable investors of over $15 million. His personal and corporate assets have been entirely, permanently frozen pending a massive federal lawsuit. Karma had finally, officially arrived at Richard's doorstep, and she had brought an entire army of federal prosecutors with her. Without the massive, illegal flow of stolen cash to prop him up, Richard's life instantly disintegrated into dust. His multiple bank accounts were immediately frozen by court order. The bank aggressively foreclosed on his massive, sprawling house in the exclusive gated community, violently changing the locks. His beloved silver Porsche was aggressively repossessed directly from his driveway in the middle of the freezing night by a tow truck. Victoria, quickly realizing the money, the status, and the glamorous lifestyle were permanently gone, immediately filed for divorce. She hired the most ruthless, bloodthirsty divorce lawyer in the city. Her lawyer aggressively stripped Richard of whatever meager, hidden personal assets he had miraculously managed to hide. She completely abandoned him, running crying back to her wealthy father's mansion, publicly and loudly claiming she was entirely an innocent victim of his massive fraud and demanding full custody of their shared assets. She didn't shed a single tear for the man. She only cried for the lost credit cards. The collateral damage, however, was what truly exposed the tragedy of my family's obsession with wealth. My parents, Eleanor and Arthur, who had foolishly and blindly invested a massive, staggering portion of their own retirement funds directly into Richard's firm, just so they could brag to their friends about being his high-rolling clients, lost absolutely everything. Their college funds for future grandchildren, their hard-earned pensions, the remaining inheritance from my grandparents. All of it completely vanished into thin air, stolen by their favorite golden child. They were violently forced to sell their massive house at a severe loss and move into a tiny, cramped, highly depressing two-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town. The golden child they had worshipped his entire life had completely, utterly bankrupted the entire family. For many long months, I heard absolutely nothing from him. I naturally assumed he was hiding in a cheap, bug-infested motel on the outskirts of the city, desperately waiting for his massive federal trial to officially begin. Then, on a freezing, pouring Tuesday night in November, exactly 2 years to the day after I first met Chloe in that coffee shop, the heavy intercom buzzer in our secure penthouse sharply rang. I paused, setting down the book I was reading, and walked slowly over to the high-tech security screen mounted on the wall. The high-definition camera showed the street-level entrance of our highly secure building. Standing there in the freezing, pouring rain, shivering violently without an umbrella, was Richard. He looked absolutely terrifyingly horrible. The expensive, custom-tailored suits were completely gone. He was wearing a cheap, thin, highly waterlogged jacket that offered absolutely no protection from the cold. His dark hair was completely unkempt and plastered to his forehead. His face was pale, gaunt, and heavily bruised by exhaustion, and he looked exactly like he hadn't slept in several agonizing weeks. He looked exactly like a broken, desperate man who had finally, painfully hit rock bottom. I hesitated for a very long moment, my finger hovering over the intercom button. I could have just completely ignored the buzzer. I could have easily called building security and had him aggressively, physically removed from the property for trespassing. He absolutely deserved it. He deserved every single ounce of pain and humiliation he was currently experiencing. But Chloe walked quietly up behind me. She placed a warm, incredibly gentle hand on my shoulder and looked deeply at the security screen. "Let him up," she said quietly, her voice full of an eerie, detached calm. "It's time to finally end this. Permanently." I pressed the button, buzzing him in. A few minutes later, the private elevator doors slid open directly into our pristine foyer. Richard stood there, dripping wet, shivering violently, actively leaving small, dirty puddles of rainwater on the highly polished, pristine hardwood floor. He slowly looked around the massive, incredibly luxurious penthouse, his red, bloodshot eyes darting frantically over the expensive, curated art on the walls and the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. The sheer disparity between our lives was glaringly, painfully obvious. He finally stopped looking around and locked eyes with me. The arrogant, highly condescending, mocking spark that had always lived in his dark eyes was completely, totally extinguished. He looked entirely hollow, like a ghost of the man who used to terrorize me. "Ethan," he croaked, his voice cracking horribly, sounding like he had been screaming for days. "Please, I have absolutely nowhere else to go. Mom and Dad won't even answer my desperate phone calls anymore because I lost their entire retirement. Victoria took absolutely everything I had left. I'm facing decades of federal prison time. My lawyer officially dropped me yesterday because I can't pay his massive retainer fee. I haven't eaten a hot, decent meal in 3 days. He took a highly shaky, pathetic step forward, his hands trembling violently at his sides. I know I was awful to you. I know I was a complete monster. I know I ruined your wedding day. But we are blood, Ethan. We are brothers. Please, I am begging you. I desperately need a loan. Just enough money to get a decent, working lawyer and a safe place to stay until the trial. You have more money than God now. You're a billionaire by marriage. $100,000 wouldn't even make a microscopic dent in your massive accounts. Please save me. I stood there silently, looking at the completely broken man who had actively made my entire childhood a living hell. This was the man who had confidently stood up at my wedding and tried to permanently destroy my life, my reputation, and my marriage just to satisfy his own massive, fragile ego. Surprisingly, I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel the burning, consuming desire for revenge that used to keep me awake at night. Looking at him now, completely stripped of his fake wealth, his toxic status, and his arrogant armor, I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of pity. You don't need a massive financial loan, Richard, I said slowly, my voice incredibly calm, measured, and completely devoid of anger. Giving you a massive check to hire an expensive lawyer so you can try to slither your way out of the severe consequences of your own highly illegal actions isn't going to actually help you. It would just be actively enabling your toxic behavior, exactly like Mom and Dad did for your entire life. I refuse to participate in that cycle. Richard's gaunt face completely crumpled. Actual tears welled up in his exhausted eyes and spilled rapidly down his cold cheeks. The great, untouchable, arrogant golden child was openly, pathetically crying in my hallway. Then what do I do, Ethan? I'm gonna literally die out there on the streets. Chloe stepped forward into the light of the foyer. She was wearing comfortable, simple sweatpants and a loose, oversized sweater, completely unbothered by his dramatic, desperate presence. She looked at him not with anger, but with the cold, calculating efficiency of a CEO. The Sterling Group owns a massive, mid-tier hotel out near the interstate highway, Chloe said flatly, her voice all business. They are currently severely understaffed in both the kitchen and maintenance departments. We can formally offer you a job. You will be aggressively washing dirty dishes, scrubbing the massive industrial floors, and taking out the heavy trash behind the kitchens. Pays exactly minimum wage, not a single penny more. You will be officially provided with a highly basic, small, single-room staff apartment in the damp basement of the hotel, and you will get exactly 1 hot meal per shift from the employee cafeteria. Richard stared at her, his jaw completely dropping in sheer, unadulterated horror and disbelief. Washing dishes? Me? Are you insane? I have a master's degree in high finance. I ran a multi-million-dollar corporate firm. I can't scrub dirty floors for minimum wage like some uneducated peasant. You ran a highly fraudulent, completely illegal Ponzi scheme, Richard. I corrected him sharply, my tone turning to absolute steel, leaving zero room for negotiation. You are a known criminal desperately waiting for a massive federal trial. Your fancy master's degree is entirely, completely worthless now. This is the absolute only offer on the table. You take the demanding job, you put your arrogant head down, you do the grueling, honest, physical labor you spent your entire life actively mocking, or you turn around, walk back out into the freezing rain, and figure it out yourself. We will absolutely not fund your legal defense. We will absolutely not give you a financial handout. You have to earn your survival. Richard looked wildly from me to Chloe, his eyes darting back and forth. He was desperately searching for a weakness, a tiny crack in our resolve, a sign that the old, easily manipulated, submissive Ethan was still hiding in there somewhere. He found absolutely nothing but an impenetrable wall of boundaries. He closed his eyes tightly, his shoulders aggressively slumping in total, utter, crushing defeat. The arrogant fight was completely gone from him forever. "Okay?" Richard whispered hoarsely, staring down at his wet, completely ruined shoes on the floor. "Okay, I'll take it. Thank you." I gave him the exact address of the hotel and firmly told him to report directly to the kitchen manager at exactly 5 a.m. the next morning. As he slowly turned and walked back into the elevator, looking exactly like a broken, hollow shell of a human being, I felt a massive, permanent weight physically lift off my chest. I had finally completely established the ultimate boundary. I had permanently broken the highly toxic cycle of my family's dysfunction. Exactly 6 months later, I briefly stopped by that specific interstate hotel to double-check on some catering details for a massive middle school event I was organizing. As I walked down the back hallway, I passed the massive, steaming, incredibly loud industrial kitchen. Through the small rectangular glass window in the heavy swinging doors, I clearly saw him. Richard was wearing a heavily stained, cheap white apron and a required hairnet. He was aggressively scrubbing baked-on, disgusting grease off a massive industrial baking pan over a huge, steaming metal sink. Sweat was heavily pouring down his red, flushed face. A much younger, demanding kitchen manager loudly barked an aggressive order at him regarding the cleanliness of the plates, and Richard simply nodded, wiped his sweating brow with his arm, and started moving much faster. He looked incredibly exhausted. He looked absolutely miserable. But for the very first time in his entire privileged life, he was actually doing honest, real hard work. He was finally, painfully learning exactly what it meant to actually earn a single dollar without illegally stealing it or maliciously crushing someone else to get it. I didn't knock on the glass. I didn't go in to say hello. I just smiled, turned around, and confidently walked out of the hotel, stepping into the bright, incredibly warm afternoon sun. I got back into my highly dependable used car and drove back to the middle school. I walked into my familiar classroom, looked at the massive history timeline I had taped on the wall, and took a deep, satisfying breath. I realized in that exact moment that the absolute greatest revenge in the world isn't about actively crushing your enemies, destroying their lives, or maliciously rubbing your newfound wealth in their faces. The greatest revenge is building a beautiful, quiet, incredibly happy life completely, totally out of their toxic reach. It is finally knowing exactly who you are, knowing exactly what your true worth is, and never, ever letting a highly toxic, abusive person dictate your value or your peace again. I am a dedicated teacher. I am a loving husband. And I am entirely, completely, beautifully free. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own toxic family members? Have you ever had to establish a hard, painful boundary to finally protect your own peace and sanity? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.